years. I lost count at about 2,000 mediation cases, and have been doing the specialty area of workplace mediation for the majority of that work. Let's see. Okay, sorry, just doing a technical issue here. So here's a little picture just for fun of an average day on the job for my mediation work, and a little bit about my information for contacting me if you'd like to get in touch and have a follow-up discussion about this. If everybody could please mute their mics. I am hearing somebody that's coughing right now, so it'd be good if we could have all mics muted. So basically in my work, I tend to get tough cases and do difficult mediations. I'm sure you all have great war stories as well. But if you're interested again in getting in touch, there's my contact information. It is helpful to get a sense of kind of who's in the room here and who's participating in terms of your mediation skills. So those of you that are able to kind of raise your hand, I'm curious how many folks have done about 10 mediations or fewer. All right, Molly Keating knows how to raise her hand in Zoom. Thank you, Molly. How about folks that have done 10 to 25 cases? All right. Seen a couple folks raising their hand. Excellent. And then how about the heavy hitters, 25 and plus, in terms of mediation experience? All right, I'm seeing hands shooting up all over the place. So it looks like we have a pretty sophisticated group of mediators here, and that's going to be helpful for our exploration of this subject, which kind of requires that you have some experience to be able to determine how to effectively end a mediation case. So the next question is whether or not you've actually pulled the plug on a mediation before. So on this one, you get to play with another one of your tools here, which is the raising of your thumbs in the reaction section. So if you have actually terminated a mediation session, raise your thumb over your picture using the reactions in the lower right part of your screen. All right. Oh, look at that. Lots, it's a sea of thumbs out there. Okay, so all of you have kind of been in that situation, or most of you, as I'm seeing here, have kind of been in the situation of having to end a mediation session. And so again, I'm working with experienced folks here and want to give you a chance to think about this in a maybe more thoughtful way, in a more deliberate way than we might have in the past. So that's kind of the intent of our presentation together. So I want to give you a little bit of kind of motivational startup for this conversation and think about what it is we're really trying to accomplish and what the idea of this presentation is to get you thinking about it in a more constructive way. I think many of us mediators tend to be pretty motivated to mediate, to try to resolve cases, that we are trained in many ways to be pretty zealous about mediation, and we're patriots about mediation. We want it to work out, and so we try to mediate, I think sometimes to a fault. Sometimes we try to mediate parties into submission in the hopes that if we just keep going, the case will work out. So I think for many of us that probably resonates and feels familiar. But there's a mindset that if we do that, if we really push it too far, then there's some chance that we can actually do damage to the parties and to the case, and actually do a disservice to folks. So that's why I wanted to explore this conversation and think about, well, what are some of the hazards of being overly zealous in our mediation work, and how can we instead be thoughtful and pull out of a case that's just not going to go anywhere? So I think there are times when it's inappropriate to pursue the case into all the way to the edge. I think sometimes that it results in us violating some of our ethics as mediators. And I also think that it leads to mediator burnout. If we just try to mediate all the way to the bitter end, every case, sometimes that's just going to create burnout for the mediators. So I found that in the course of my career, I've become more and more comfortable with the reality that some cases just aren't set or suited for mediation, and that we need to really kind of withdraw from the process and kind of do a mercy ending to the mediation process. So I think that's where this is coming from for me. So in terms of where we're going with all this, I want to give you a set of outcomes, and some of you have the materials in front of you, so I'd invite you to look at the PDF that Christina sent out. All right, so the purpose of our time together, know when to stop it and how to do so in an appropriate way. 4 outcomes for our time together. First one is to state with conviction that you are empowered to terminate a mediation process. So this is, I think we all know that we're allowed to do this, but I want you to really kind of embrace this idea that it's okay, that it's even part of your ethics and your practice as a mediator to be able to stop a mediation session that's kind of ill-fated. Number 2, list 5 reasons why you might terminate a mediation intervention. So think about it and be able to think ahead about when you're going to pull the plug and when that might be the right thing to do. Number 3 is describe at least 8 actions or ways to end the process. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks and thoughts about how to do this. Also want to mine the group for some thoughts on how to do it effectively as well. And then at the end of this, I hope you all will have kind of your own script, your own way of rehearsing and thinking about in advance what you're going to do to be effective in shutting down a mediation session. So I'm sure all that sounds very kind of cheerful. This topic is a little dreary. You know, it's not what we usually like to focus on as mediators. Most of the time we want to solve all the problems and keep mediating, but sometimes there's a need to stop things. So I want to be real clear up front that my presentation today is really about ending the process. This is not like a impasse busting kind of presentation where we're trying to figure out how we're going to get mediations just to the brink and then figure out, well, how can we pull it back from the brink right at the last second. I really am genuinely talking here about how to end a mediation session. And so there's no tricks up my sleeve here about, well, this is really about just another tactic to try to get the case resolved. I really am talking about stopping the mediation process. All right, so that's kind of the setup for our time together. If you have any questions along the way here, please private chat those to Christina, and or I guess you can publicly do that as well. But anyway, Christina will be kind of monitoring the chats as we go along. So the first question I have for you is kind of the potential consequences of a mismanaged termination. So if we're going to start tiptoeing into this area, I'd like you all to think about what are some of the consequences if we don't kind of end the case well. So that's the first thing I'd like you to consider. If you could kind of write in some chats, and I'll have Christina read those out for us. Anything that anybody wants to put in kind of the public chat. What are the consequences of a mismanaged mediation termination? Christina, you getting any chats for us?
Yeah, so we're saying seen as a non-neutral, a bad resolution, you might lose credibility as the mediator, and there could be emotional trauma for the parties.
Okay.
And bad reviews, and potentially breach confidentiality.
Okay, all right. All right, so those are all kind of helpful ways of considering the negative ramifications if we don't resolve or don't kind of close out the case in a thoughtful and helpful way for the parties. I think there's all the other things that we talk about in terms of selling mediation up front to parties. If you don't resolve it, there might be further escalation, but the same is true if we end the mediation poorly. So it might kind of lead to further escalation down the road if they're going to leave hot and the case is left in a kind of poor state by the mediator at the end, then it might just escalate for the parties even further, and they'll be worse off than if they had not gone to mediation at all. And again, all the corollary issues here about reduced effectiveness of their communications, further breakdown in their relationship, more likely that they're going to end up in an adversarial process. So all of those things are still true in terms of how we terminate the mediation and if we do it poorly. So let's think about a little more about the authority to end a mediation session. So this is kind of one of my 4 big takeaways for today, is to help you think about how to terminate a mediation and to do it in a way that you do with conviction so that you know you have the ability. So what do these 2 buildings have to do with this? Well, it's just kind of a way of graphically thinking about this. We honest, you know, any honest mediator will tell you, and I'm sure you all are honest mediators, that about 75% of the cases resolve. And I think we highlight that for parties and really emphasize that as part of our kind of soft sales about mediation, that it resolves. But it does leave out this question of what's our failure rate? How many cases don't resolve? And of course, the number there is about 25% of the time. So we tend to focus on the 75%, but we give kind of scant attention to that 25%. So that's part of, again, my kind of mission here is to give us a chance to be more thoughtful about that 25%. So I really do believe that you all have permission to end the mediation process, and to kind of demonstrate that for you, I wanted to show you some, let's see, I wanted to show you some of the materials that pertain to this. So Christine, I know I said I was going to ask you to share the materials, but I do have them up here and I think I can handle this part. So I'm pointing you to this section in your materials, those that have it on page 1. And of course, we Oregonians kind of have our own standards of practice. Most states I know adopted the Association for Conflict Resolution, of which our Chicago members here are chapter members, and we'll look at those in a moment. But just for fun, we'll look at the Oregon one. And it says in our standards, says mediators should suspend and or withdraw from the mediation if they believe the party's unable to give informed consent. Another place where we're authorized to decline the mediation or to withdraw, where the mediator has questions about their ability to give impartial regard and the issue can't be resolved, the mediator will decline or withdraw if already serving. So again, the key word here is withdraw. Now the rest of these, I have 4 or 5 quotes, and these are all from ACR's standards of practice. And so the first one, if at any time mediator is unable to conduct in an impartial manner, mediator shall withdraw. So that's if you can't conduct the mediation in a way that's neutral. If a mediator determines the mediator cannot conduct competently, the mediator shall discuss it with the parties, blah, 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 and up to withdrawing. So the mediator can withdraw there as well. If the conflict of interest is an issue, then the mediator shall withdraw. So you see a common theme kind of recurring here in the ACR standards, that the mediator has the right, has the authority, the ability, the power, all of those things to withdraw from the mediation process if it's just not working, or if there are reasons of ethics and standards that come into play. So those are the first things to consider, is to kind of make this call to end the process. You do have the right to do that, and as a mediator, at times you have the ethical responsibility to do that as well. So that's what's important about this section that we're looking at right now. So for the question then becomes, when do you terminate a session? And some of those things are implied in those standards, but I also wanted to give you kind of a framework for thinking about this as well. So let's see, we're going to look at another document here. Also in your material, those of you that have the materials, you can look on page 2 towards the bottom. And then it goes over to page 3 as well. But we're talking about kind of when and what circumstances the mediator might stop the mediation process. So I want to give you another way of thinking about this as well. All right. Okay, I know we're all learning Zoom together, right? Okay, so here again in your materials, you see page 2 and 3, there's some sections where we talk about the kinds of dynamics and situations which might prompt the end of a mediation session. So my master's thesis was on the subject of why people in workplaces refuse to enter into a mediation session when it's offered. So this is my master's thesis work 20 years ago or so now. But I categorized 5 different areas where parties might withdraw or refuse to participate in the mediation process. And I categorize those across these different 5 categories. So one is individual or personality issues. People are just not acting well, they're kind of misbehaving, if you will, as parties in the mediation process. So for some reason that's kind of intrapsychic within the individual, makes them a poor candidate for mediation in the first place. Or again, for our purposes today, that somebody is acting in a way individually, their individual behavior that merits the mediator terminating the mediation process. So that's kind of one category and a way to think about. There are cases where the individual as a party is engaging in such a way that makes the mediation worth terminating. Number two is the interactions. So this is more of the interpersonal dynamic between the two parties in the mediation process. They're doing something, they're interacting in a way that's creating an impossible situation or making it difficult to mediate, and thus leading to the need to terminate the session. So that's a kind of a second category. So it's not just the individual, but also the dynamic between the individuals. Number three is the objective conflict facts. So this is just, there's something about the case that means that it's not going to work out. There's some objective reality. It's a egregious performance problem might be an example about why you would mediate or stop the mediation process in a workplace setting. Number four is organizational barriers. Might be a power structure issue in the organization. Again, this is my field of workplace mediation, but that's kind of a form of an objective reason to terminate the mediation process. And number five is mediation ethical issues. So those are different kinds of cases and situations where you might terminate the mediation process. And you have some of that in your material to kind of get you started on that. What I'm going to ask for at this stage is a breakout session. So I'm going to ask you all to think about this question of why we might terminate the mediation process. So this is going to be our breakout. I'm going to ask Christina to set up breakout rooms. We're going to have about 5 people per room with about a 4-minute timer. So Christina, you're going to be able to pull that out for us?
I just sent an invite to everybody, so you should have got a notice.
Okay, great, thank you. And those will be about 4 minutes, and you all contemplate that question together, and then we'll check back in with you. If you could have a presenter kind of share with us when you come back, that'd be great. See you in about 5 minutes.
turn your head. Chris, would you like me to close the rooms? Once I do, it'll still give them about 1 minute before they have fully closed.
In my experience on a couple.
I'm told we're going to terminate and go back to the regular mediation.
Okay, folks, welcome back. Hope you had a nice opportunity to chat with your colleagues there about this question about why and when you've terminated some sessions. I think we all have good stories about those cases that were just not well suited for the work that we do. And I know in my little breakout group, I got to hear some ideas on that. Would anybody like to share any kind of major takeaways or observations from your private conversations there? If so, you can let Christina know in the chat area. So Christina, if anybody volunteers to share, maybe you could unmute them and let them give their thoughts.
Everybody is able to unmute themselves as well, so.
Okay, I was hoping you might call on people though, so we have some control over how many folks jump in. So I'll give about 15 seconds for anybody to jump in and volunteer any thoughts on kind of why you might terminate the session.
I know someone put, if someone was under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or if they weren't really holding up to the good faith participation that they agreed to at the start, or neither party is really doing anything to move forward.
Okay.
Or if parties disagree on basic facts.
Okay, so obviously lots of different reasons why we might do it. And I have a couple of pet stories as well. So on in your materials there, let's see, a couple of cases that I experienced. This first one, case number one, I had two coworkers that had negative interactions in mediation to try to work out their workplace relationship, but one of the parties was just overwrought and cried during much of the open session, got her into a private caucus session, and then she deteriorated further into kind of sobbing and inconsolable emotional outpouring. So at that point, she came up with all kinds of other reasons that her life was off the rails and decided that it was a disservice to try to keep her in mediation. So we terminated the session. And some of these bring up questions that we're going to explore later in the conversation here about when you stop the mediation session. Do you do it in joint session, in private caucus? So those are some other considerations. Another case was number two on my list here was a employee made a very crude comment to the manager. They were in an EEO type mediation process. And during this mediation, it became evident that the union member was really just trying to come at management from another angle, using the mediation process as yet another tool in his ongoing multi-front war against management to try to get the organization unionized. So really wasn't there in good faith. And so it terminated the mediation session on that case as well. Case number 3, and I won't go over all these, but the next one is where the parties were doing multiple sessions. At one of the subsequent sessions, 2 or 3 in, party A tells me that party B is talking about the mediation confidentiality all across the organization. I asked the party about that directly, and they say, yeah, but there's nothing the mediator can do about it. Well, actually there is. I don't have to mediate, and I have the right to withdraw. So that was another example where I withdrew from the mediation process. So those, and you can read the other examples in terms of when mediation sessions were actually terminated. So that's kind of the first step for us to consider today, is when you would do it. And I hope that your conversation and some of these examples give you some sense of when you might stop the mediation process. The next question, if we've established that you are allowed to, that at times there are times when you can, and there are places where you should, the next question becomes how you stop the mediation process. So I want to give you all a chance to reflect on that question in terms of how you end the mediation process. And we're going to take a look at this next question also in a kind of a breakout format. So I want to give you all the chance, without looking at your materials, just kind of organically among yourselves, think about how you would end the process. So think about what you would actually say. And there's some real concrete considerations here. For example, what are you thinking? What are your thoughts? How do you construct this in your mind and rationalize it to yourself about why you're going to end the mediation process? What do you actually do? So what are your actions? Are you in private session with one party? Are you with both parties? Then what are the statements? What do you actually say out loud to the parties? If you're co-mediating, what is the conversation like between you and your co-mediator? And the stage might be important here too. Are you 10 minutes into the mediation session, or are you 3 hours? Are you on the 5th case or the fifth iteration of the same case? So there's lots of different considerations here about when you might actually stop the process and how you would do that. Now I have some kind of what I think of as best practices here that I'm going to share with you eventually, but I want you all to, again, organically come up with your own thinking on this and invite you to do so in another breakout session. So I'm going to ask Christina again to set up about 5-person conversations. We'll set that for about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll come back together and take a look at what you all have developed, as well as some best practices from my experience as well. All right, have fun out there. We'll see you in a little bit.
Well, hello? Can you still hear me, or am I gone? No?
Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to the group session. Hope you had a lively discussion there about those questions about how you would terminate the session, and thinking in advance about those different dynamics that happen and what you need to be thinking about. What are you saying out loud? What are you doing strategically? How are you closing it out? So those are the kind of questions that want you all to come away with some concrete thoughts and kind of a script even for yourselves about how to do this the next time it happens in a more thoughtful way. You know, I'm going to tell a story on myself here of the case that I did not long ago that I'm not particularly proud of, and it had everything to do with how poorly I ended the case. So I think that's part of what got me thinking about how to do this more effectively. I think one of the last things we want to be as mediators is kind of emotionally reactive to parties, but I had a case where this one particular, was 3 parties in a workplace, 2 employees and their supervisor. And one of the employees just kept going back over and over again, old territory, just couldn't make progress. It would seem like we were getting somewhere, and then she would just throw the whole thing out and go back to old wounds and old hurts. That pattern just was so hard to break. Had her in caucus for a while, finally got through, had a second session, had her in caucus then again, breakthrough, got her back in open session, and she regresses yet again. And I hope it'll be the only time in my career where I did this, but I just closed my book up and I said, I'm sorry, we're done. I don't think I can help you all. So I was just walked away and very upset with myself, even in the moment, about ending it so poorly. So with that kind of as a tale upon my own transgressions in this regard, want to give you all some ways to not do that and to be more effective. So let's take a look at some of the materials that I have for you here. And again, you can follow along if you have it. There's kind of a fill in the blank just for fun to make it even more interactive. But there's three parts to this. And there's first phase is before you terminate the case. The second one is that termination moment and what you actually do in the moment when you're talking to the parties and what you're, how you're acting. And then post-termination, what do you do after you have closed down a case? So let's take a look at the first set of questions here and some thoughts for you. Page 4. So can you, and the answer is, articulate to yourself why you're withdrawing from the service. So it can't just be an emotional reaction. I think that's what my story kind of brought up for me, was that I was reacting to the party rather than really rationally thinking through why I was going to terminate that case. So I think it helps us pause and be deliberate and thoughtful about why we're withdrawing from the case. So that's the first step. The second one is, have you provided some forewarning to the parties that you might terminate because of their behavior? So the 3 words to fill in here, and I'm sorry, if everybody could mute themselves, there's some background noise. So have you provided forewarning is the first one, that the current trajectory or the current behaviors or whatever it is might result in your decision to terminate. So I think it's incumbent on us as mediators to not just pull the plug like I did in that case, but rather to kind of give them a chance to salvage the case, to change their behavior. And so in part that's strategic. Sometimes that, you know, it's tactical and strategic that we're encouraging parties to get back into the negotiation process, or we might stop the case. But other times we're sincere about that. And so I think you need to forewarn people about it. The third bullet is to decide is this a pause or is this an actual end of the process? Because of course, in most settings, other than like small claims diversion programs, you have the opportunity to come back at a future date. You have a chance to work individually with parties between sessions and things like that. So you do need to decide if this is so egregious that this is the end of mediation, or is this the end of this mediation? And so that's what we're talking about here. The next kind of sub-bullet there is how serious are you? So really think about that. And what if the parties say, hey, let's not stop, let's continue. So they might change their behavior. So the sentence there reads, what if the parties state that they will change their behavior if you agree to continue the process? Okay. And you have to think that through a little bit. So my sobbing party that was completely distraught and emotionally incapable of engaging in the process or with her colleague, that was not a case that I would have continued even if she had said, oh, you know, just give me a box of Kleenex and I'll be okay and I can keep going. Well, it was clearly my determination that she was not a good candidate for continued mediation, and it would be kind of cruel and unusual to continue trying to mediate with her. So that's an example of when you just need to make that decision. The second sub-bullet here is suggesting termination can be an impasse breaking technique. Now, again, I know talking to a lot of experienced mediators here, so you know that sometimes there's nothing quite as powerful as the mediator kind of closing up their mediation notebook and indicating to the parties that you're going to bail out of the session because of their inability or intransigence or their behavior, or comments or whatever. So that can be a technique. But again, we're not talking about mediation termination here as just a technique. But if you're thinking of it as a technique, then just know that you're doing that versus that you're serious about closing the case down. The next bullet is, have you consulted with your mediation support network? So some folks on the Zoom today are part of programs, and folks that joined us from Oregon, for example, are with different mediation programs, community programs, and workplace programs, et cetera. So you can always check in with your kind of handler and your support network if possible, and can you get advice from your fellow ADR resources? So that's what that next bullet's all about. Next bullet is determine what can be shared. So if you're deciding before you're terminating the case that you're doing it in a private session because you just heard something really egregious from one party, so you might think, oh, well, that what I just heard from party A here in caucus is a death knell for the mediation. Well, what are you going to say then to the other party? How is that confidential, what you just heard? Are you going to work that information back into your caucus with party A again or not? So you have to be thoughtful and mindful about confidentiality is what that's all about. The next bullet is, if your decision comes during a joint session, then take a break to consider this issue that's come up. So again, you don't have to make the decision right in the moment. I certainly wish in the case that I conveyed to you all where I just pulled the plug rather abruptly that I had just instead taken a break. It would have been a moment for me to walk around the building like I sometimes encourage parties to do, and just to think about what I'm going to do and what the best next step might be. So always know you can press the pause button and just take a break. Let's see, the next one is decide if the announcement should be jointly or in caucus. So what I've been alluding to here is a question. And I think joint announcements, to fill in the blank here on the last couple lines, a joint announcement is more clear, it's more honest, it's more definitive. So I think as with mediation generally, if we can do it in open session, that's kind of the bolder, stronger approach to our work as mediators. But if we make the decision to do it in caucus, then that might be more appropriate. And that's that last item here, because it's, it might be that the emotions are so out of control, or there's some dynamic that makes it implausible or ill-advised to try to mediate closure in private session. All right, so those are all thoughts about how to end the mediation session before you actually do it. And I have a long list of thoughts here about the termination moment itself. So let me walk you through these. The first thing is to explain that you're invoking the mediator's right to withdraw. And I have some sample language here. So the first part of our conversation today was about how you actually are empowered to do this based on your ethics and laws and rules and what governs us as mediators. So if you feel that that's important, then you have the right to withdraw, and you should tell the parties, you know. So the sample quote here is, I'd like to refer to the agreement that you signed at the beginning of the process that mentions everybody's right to withdraw from the process. So just kind of normalize it, that it's something that you're doing, that just as they had the right to withdraw, you have the right to withdraw as well. Next bullet is to state the reasons that you're terminating the process. So you have to remember about confidentiality and that you're doing this within the guidelines and the parameters of confidentiality. So you're not going to say, because party B told me in caucus that they've already got another job and are just doing this to annoy their supervisor before they quit tomorrow. So whatever the case might be, you want to be thoughtful about that. And then you also might consider your mediation ethics and to reinforce the explanation of your decision. So I shared with you the Oregon standards, the ACR standards. So there are things that you can kind of cite as reasons for your withdrawal from the mediation process that really enhances your reputation if you're doing it in an ethical way and demonstrating that to the parties. Next one is next bullet here, number 3, is to normalize the non-resolution outcome. So I've shared with parties that, you know, mediation works sometimes it doesn't. It's not a panacea. It's not going to resolve every situation. And as you know from the beginning here, we had a chance that this would work out, and we were hopeful that it would, but 25% of them don't. So that's okay, and just kind of normalize it, make it feel like the parties haven't failed is kind of the intent of that one. And still, they might feel like they have failed in some way. So bullet number 4 here is to acknowledge and discuss the emotional impacts that people might be experiencing. And you can just check in with the parties and say, you know, from the way you're reacting, I see this isn't the outcome that either of you wanted or were hoping for when we began. I can tell there's some disappointment that it didn't work out, yada, yada. So something that just kind of acknowledges where folks are at this point. Then I think it's also important to acknowledge the that you, let's see, commend the parties for the positive aspects of their participation. So kind of a baby with the bathwater scenario, right? You don't want to tell the parties that it's all a fail. Sometimes it can be even 80% success, but they just didn't get that last 20%. So in any event, to highlight the positive aspects of their participation in the process. So something like, I appreciate your willingness to try to resolve it today through mediation, that you stuck with the process this long. So something that commends them. Hope you got some value out of it. I hope that you were able to gain some new information. Hope that it gives you different perspective. You're able to hear the other person's point of view, et cetera, et cetera. Those things that we kind of naturally tend to do as mediators anyway, but to highlight that in this moment as you're kind of exiting the process. And then, so that really gets to the next one here, highlighting the progress that they made and underscore the agreements that they made. So those are important things to do as well. Another thing to do is to highlight what didn't get resolved. So that's where I am right now, with highlight the issues that remain unresolved. And this helps them understand the scope of non-resolution. So again, you don't want to whitewash that, well, it didn't work out. You all almost got there. You made a lot of progress. You know, look, you were doing really well. You just couldn't resolve everything. But to be very specific and say, so you are still unresolved about the issue of Sally's next assignment, and you're unclear about how you're going to deal with some of the issues related to the tasks and responsibilities that Fred has. So you're just being explicit and highlighting for them so that they walk away with some value from the end of the mediation, knowing what it is that they didn't resolve, so that they might know what their assignments are to work on in the future. So that's an important consideration as well. And then also clarify what your next steps will be, so that you are explaining to them what it is you're going to be doing, and be clear that you might explain this to, in my cases, I'm going to be reporting back to HR, for example. I'm not going to tell any details. I'm just going to, but I like the parties to know what I'm going to tell their HR director or the CEO or whoever brought me into the case. But I'm going to say, and get their kind of approval, I'll tell your HR director that we met in 2 sessions for a total of about 6 hours, and that in the end they didn't have a resolution, and that they'll be discussing next steps with their internal resources like HR and their supervisors. So that might be the extent of what I say back to management, but I want the parties to know what I'm going to say. Next one is to encourage a return. So we're right here, encouraging a return to mediation in the future if it changes. But you have to be sincere about this. You don't want to encourage parties to come back if you never want to see them ever again. And there's certainly cases like that, right, where we really don't want to see people or don't think that they're good candidates and probably would never be good candidates. But sometimes mediation is going to be useful for them in the future if they can get past some sticky parts So you might suggest that they return to mediation. Next one is remind them that confidentiality is still in effect. So you want to highlight for them mediation confidentiality that they signed at the beginning, that they pledged to throughout, remains in effect. Just because the mediation's ending doesn't mean confidentiality is now out the door. And then last couple items here about kind of in the moment considerations is if it's appropriate, then you might ask them to share their closing thoughts with each other. So that's the blank lines there. Just if it seems like it's okay, if it's not like a high emotional agitation, and that's not the reason you're ending the case, it's just they really did reach a point where they can't agree with each other. So that might be okay to just ask them to share their closing thoughts. What value did you get out of today? What are your thoughts about the fact that we're ending the process, and give them a chance to share their thoughts, that it's not just kind of a mediator speech at this point. And then ask for any mediation at the end, hand out any surveys or any of the usual stuff you give to parties, and invite feedback. So at my company, In Accord, we always send 4-question surveys through SurveyMonkey to all the participants. And that's the kind of feedback we really want, particularly when things don't go well or there's no resolution. That can be useful information as well. Let's see, last thing here, and then I'm going to invite you all to consider some of these things again with some open forum here. But the last couple of thoughts, just while you're terminating the case after this termination decision has been made, complete all your paperwork, and reflect on why the case didn't turn out well. Why wasn't there a resolution? I think I'm always impressed with mediators that have done 10 cases and can tell you what they learned from all 10 versus mediators that have done 1,000 and don't really remember any of kind of the nuance of what they learned in each case. So those are some of the considerations. And then at some future point, you might check in with them and see if there's some value in coming back into the mediation process. So those are the thoughts that I have for you all, and hopeful that you have those materials. If you want to get that material, you can email either me or you can email Christina, and I can get this material to you. So with 4 minutes to go, I'm going to close down the sharing screen here and just invite any kind of closing comments, thoughts, reactions, inputs, or other objections from anybody who'd like to share. All right, I see the chat is just lighting up here with all kinds of chat. Thank you for your comments. So I want to, maybe as a grand finale, oh, do I hear a comment coming in?
Well, I just wanted to say that, there's this notion, about process satisfaction. In other words, if we go through this, hour or two and aren't able to come to an agreement, I like to at least end it in such a way that each of the parties feels that each one has had an opportunity, to tell their story, to be heard and to be acknowledged, and so that they leave at least with a feeling of what I call process satisfaction. For me, that's the best case scenario in a situation where we're unable to reach agreement at that point.
Alan, I'm glad you said that. There's a statistic I always like to share in the basic mediation trainings I do, which is Oregon years ago had the Oregon Dispute Resolution Commission, a statewide commission that was overseeing all the mediation in Oregon at the community level. Is a great program. But in any event, they did analysis of mediations across the state. They were able to ask exit surveys of thousands of parties, and the statistic held true. About 75% or so of the cases resolved. But then they asked a question in several different ways about satisfaction, and the satisfaction rate, of course, with mediation is sky high. It's, in this case, it was 98%. And those were the kind of, would you come back to mediation, blah, blah, blah. Would you recommend it to a friend? Was it a good experience? Whatever. The question was, they added up to that 98%. And that's an amazing gap, though, of 23% between people that didn't settle, the people that settled and the ones that didn't settle, but are still satisfied and will still use the process again. So I think, again, to keep that high of a level of satisfaction for parties if we can terminate the case in a thoughtful and meaningful way, then we can help maintain that satisfaction. So I appreciate your thought on that, Alan. All right, so since we're tiptoeing right up to 11 o'clock, I want to honor everybody's time here and just go back over our outcomes for today. First one was, and let me get your thumb ratings on these. So reactions lower right corner. Are you able to, and you can just do it cumulatively, but can you state with conviction why you might terminate a mediation session? Can you list 5, oh, I'm sorry, I got 2 things messed up there. First one is state with conviction that you're allowed to and should at times terminate a mediation session. That was goal number 1. Number 2 was at least 5 reasons about why you might terminate a mediation session. Number 3 is describing at least 8 actions or comments that you would make for ending the process. And grand finale is developing kind of your own termination script, which that'll be your homework to do after today. Folks, that's all we got. Christina, I'll turn it back to you if you have anything you want to do for closing it out, but it's been nice to work with you all. Good luck out there, and looking forward to the day when we can get back in real rooms with real clients and start mediating again. So take care, everybody.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much. We have lots of positive comments. That was very helpful and a very succinct and organized framework. So thank you everyone for joining. Hopefully it was a little diversion from life as it currently is. And I put it in the chat, but just in case no one saw it, if you wanted MCLE continuing ed for this, please just email info@acr-chicago.org and give us your contact information, like name, email, and license number, and we will get that out to you. So thank you again, everyone, and thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
Okay.